Early 1999, a nursing home in Dallas, Texas. One man, officially dead, walking free. And the craziest part? He faked his own death, with forged medical records and a single phone call. Stephen J. Russell was serving 144 years for fraud and multiple escapes. In 1998, he convinced prison officials he was dying of AIDS. They transferred him to a civilian facility. Then he called the prison himself, posing as a doctor, and declared himself dead. But this isn't just a story about faking death to escape. It's about the man who walked out of Texas prisons 4 separate times, using nothing but charm and audacity. The con artist who impersonated a judge over the phone to lower his own bail. And the love that drove him to risk everything, again and again. After his death, he lived under an alias in Florida, used credit cards and fake names, in a state where every agency had his photo on file. This is how the man they called Houdini pulled off 4 impossible escapes from Texas prisons and proved that love makes people do extraordinary things. Stephen J. Russell wasn't always a criminal. In the 1970s, he lived what looked like a conventional life. He married a woman. He played organ at his church every Sunday. He kept a steady job. From the outside, everything looked normal. But Stephen was hiding something, a part of himself he couldn't reconcile with the life he was living. In the early 1980s, at age 32, Stephen came out as gay. It was 1983. The AIDS crisis was just beginning. Being openly gay meant facing discrimination, fear, and hostility everywhere. His world collapsed almost immediately. He lost his job within a month. Friends from church stopped calling. The comfortable life he'd built vanished overnight. Stephen grew bitter, desperate for money, desperate for acceptance, desperate for a way to prove he could still be somebody. By his early 30s, he started running small scams, credit card fraud, fake insurance claims. Nothing violent, just deception. He was good at it. Too good. In 1992, one of those insurance scams caught up with him. Police arrested him for fraud. The charge wasn't major. 6 months in Harris County Jail in Houston, a relatively light sentence. Stephen could have served his time quietly, but then he received devastating news. April 1993, 1 month into his sentence. His boyfriend was dying. The man Stephen loved was suffering from AIDS. He had weeks left, maybe less, and Stephen was locked in a cell, unable to say goodbye. The thought was unbearable. Stephen wasn't a violent man, but he realized the only way to be with his dying partner was to escape. How do you escape from a jail in broad daylight without a weapon? He started watching, studying routines, looking for weaknesses. What he found changed everything. Harris County Jail wasn't a maximum security prison. It was a holding facility for people awaiting trial or serving short sentences. Built in the 1950s, the facility was outdated, overcrowded. Security was relaxed compared to state prisons. Stephen spent his first week just watching. He noticed guards took smoke breaks at 10:15 a.m., again at 2:30 p.m., and once more at 6:45 p.m., like clockwork. During those breaks, certain doors were left momentarily unattended, covered by only 1 guard instead of 2. The jail used a simple color-coded system. Inmates wore orange jumpsuits. Staff wore black pants and dark shirts. No complex security badges, no biometric scanners. Just colors and assumptions. Stephen saw his opening. But how do you get civilian clothes inside a jail? He needed 2 things. Something that looked like a uniform, and something that could pass as official equipment. Over several days in early May 1993, Stephen searched carefully. During recreation time, he noticed the laundry carts moving through the corridors. Sometimes, guards didn't watch every item that came through. In a trash bin near the laundry sorting room, he found it, an old pair of black work pants. Someone had thrown them away, too worn for official use, ripped at one knee. But the color was right, dark enough to pass at a glance. Stephen took them, hid them under his mattress. 2 days later, he discovered something even better. In another trash pile near the maintenance area, a broken walkie-talkie. The battery was dead, the antenna was cracked. But it looked official enough from a distance. That's all that mattered. He had his disguise. Now, he just needed the courage to use it. Stephen chose Friday, May 13th, 1993. He'd later call it his lucky day. He spent the entire morning of May 12th watching, timing everything. The guard rotations, the shift changes, when the cameras panned away from certain corridors. He noticed something crucial. During the 9:30 a.m. shift change, guards moved between stations for approximately 7 minutes. In that window, the secure exit door was covered by only one person. Someone who didn't know every inmate's face by heart. That night, Stephen barely slept. He ran through the plan in his mind. Every step, every possible thing that could go wrong. What if the guard recognized him? What if someone asked for his employee number? What if another inmate called out his name? But his dying boyfriend's face kept appearing in his mind. The thought of never seeing him again was worse than any risk. Friday morning, May 13th, 1993, 9:15 a.m. Stephen waited in his cell, his heart pounded, but his hands were steady. 9:25 a.m., 5 minutes until shift change. He pulled on the black pants over his orange jumpsuit, found a plain dark gray shirt he'd borrowed from another inmate, tucked the orange uniform underneath. From a distance, he looked like maintenance staff. Close up, the disguise would fall apart instantly. Would anyone look close enough? He had to move fast, act confident, never give anyone a reason to look twice. 9:28 a.m., 2 minutes. Stephen took a deep breath, picked up the broken walkie-talkie, held it like it was his most important possession. He stepped out of his cell. 9:30 a.m., the shift change began. Guards moved between stations, some heading to break rooms, others taking their positions. For exactly 7 minutes, the secure exit was vulnerable. Stephen walked down the corridor, not fast, not slow, just the pace of someone who'd done this 100 times before. He passed 2 inmates. They stared at him, confused, but said nothing. One of them opened his mouth, about to shout, about to call out his name, then closed it, looked away. Maybe he recognized the look in Stephen's eyes. Maybe he understood what was happening. Maybe he simply decided not to get involved. A guard glanced over from across the room. Stephen kept walking, didn't make eye contact, didn't speed up. Just a worker heading out, nothing unusual. He reached the secure door. The guard station was right there, one person, a younger guard Stephen had seen a few times, but never spoken to. This was it, the moment everything depended on. Stephen raised the walkie-talkie, tapped it twice against the metal door frame. Clack, clack. The sharp sound echoed, like someone impatient to get through, like a worker who'd been called to an emergency. The guard glanced up, looked at Stephen for exactly 2 seconds. What did he see? Black pants, dark shirt, a walkie-talkie, someone who acted like he belonged. The guard reached for the button. Time slowed. Stephen's pulse hammered in his ears. The button clicked. The door buzzed. The lock disengaged. Stephen pushed through, walked into the outer corridor. Behind him, the door swung shut with a heavy clang. He was through. But he wasn't out yet. The outer corridor led to the main exit. Another 50 feet. Another checkpoint. But this guard station monitored people coming in, not going out. The guard at the main exit barely looked up. He hit the release for the exterior door. Stephen pushed through. And suddenly, he was outside. Standing on the sidewalk, cars passing by, people walking to work, normal life happening all around him. He'd done it. Stephen J. Russell had walked out of Harris County Jail, in broad daylight, through the front door. No tunnel, no violence, no weapons, no elaborate blueprints. Just confidence, a pair of black pants, and a broken walkie-talkie. He headed straight to the hospital where his boyfriend lay dying. For a few hours, Stephen got exactly what he wanted. He sat by his lover's bedside, held his hand, said the things he needed to say. His boyfriend died shortly after, with Stephen there. In that sense, the escape worked, but how long could he stay free? Within 3 weeks, authorities tracked him down. They arrested him and brought him back to jail. His original 6-month sentence ballooned into several years. But Stephen barely cared. His lover was gone. Nothing else mattered. Back behind bars in the mid-1990s, Stephen met someone who would change his life again. Philip Morris, a soft-spoken inmate serving time for a minor offense. They were nothing alike. Philip was quiet, reserved, the opposite of Stephen's bold personality. But somehow, they connected. They shared conversations in the prison yard, laughed together, made plans for the future. Stephen fell in love. Again. In 1995, both men were released on parole. Finally, they were free together. They moved in together, started building a life. Philip wanted something simple, quiet, honest. But Stephen wanted to prove himself, to show Philip he could provide a lavish lifestyle. The problem was Stephen's skills weren't in honest work. Using fake credentials and natural charm, Stephen talked his way into a position as chief financial officer at a medical insurance company in Texas. The interview took place in September 1995. Stephen wore a borrowed suit, carried forged references from companies that barely existed. He spoke confidently about financial systems he'd never used, quoted figures from industries he'd never worked in. The hiring manager was impressed. Stephen got the job. How did he fool an entire company? Just confidence, forged documents, and the ability to make people trust him. He showed up every day, wore expensive suits he'd bought on credit, spoke the language of business with fluency. His coworkers found him charming, intelligent, a little arrogant maybe, but competent. Nobody questioned his credentials. Nobody ran a deep background check. How long could he keep up the lie? By November 1995, Stephen had full access to the company's financial systems. Bank accounts, wire transfers, premium payments from thousands of policyholders. Millions of dollars moving through accounts every day. And Stephen, sitting right in the middle of it all, began to skim. November 15th, 1995. His first fraudulent transfer, $3,500 to a fake vendor account. Not huge amounts at first, small enough to look like accounting errors. He created fake vendor accounts, approved his own fraudulent invoices, transferred money to shell companies he'd set up. Month after month, the embezzlement grew. By January 1996, he'd taken over $100,000. By March 1996, the total exceeded $300,000. By June 1996, it was over $800,000. At the company's Christmas party, Stephen raised a champagne glass, smiled at his colleagues. Nothing like other people's premiums to keep the lights on, he joked. Everyone laughed, clinked glasses, thought he was being clever and corporate. No one realized he meant it literally. Stephen and Philip were living like millionaires. A BMW parked in the driveway, Rolex watches on their wrists, designer clothes in their closets. They ate at the finest restaurants in Houston, got cosmetic treatments at exclusive clinics, took weekend trips to Miami and Los Angeles. For nearly a year, they lived the fantasy. But the law eventually caught up. In 1996, his employer discovered the massive fraud. Police arrested Stephen. Philip was also taken in, though his involvement was minor. This time, Stephen faced serious charges. The judge, well aware of Stephen's history, set bail at $900,000. An enormous sum, designed to keep him locked up until trial. For most people, that would be the end. But for Stephen Russell, it was just another problem to solve. How do you escape from jail when the bail is nearly $1 million? Sitting in his cell, Stephen conceived one of his boldest cons yet. He couldn't pay $900,000, so he decided to make the system lower it. How do you get a judge to reduce your bail? Simple, you become the judge. Stephen placed a phone call to the court clerk, used a confident, authoritative tone, claimed to be the judge handling his case. Good morning, this is the judge on the Russell matter. Reduce bail to $45,000 and file the order today, please. The clerk hesitated, but Stephen sounded legitimate, professional. He followed up with forged paperwork, fabricated court orders on official-looking letterhead. Incredibly, the change went through. Stephen's bail dropped from $900,000 to $45,000. He scraped together a small fraction of that amount, paid a bond agent using a phony check that wouldn't clear for days. The bond agent processed the release. Stephen walked out the front door of the jail. Again. He had impersonated a judge, forged court documents, talked his way to freedom. But how long could he stay free this time? Only about a week. Stephen fled Texas with Philip. They headed to Florida, hoping to disappear. But authorities were already tracking him. They'd tapped phone lines, monitored associates. In early 1997, police found them in Florida, arrested both men without incident. In court, Stephen received a 45-year sentence for the fraud, additional years for the judge impersonation, plus time for the earlier escape. At roughly 40 years old, Stephen was looking at spending the rest of his life in prison. Philip received a lighter sentence. He'd be out in a few years. But Stephen was sent to maximum security, separated from the man he loved. Most people would have given up. Stephen Russell was not most people. Inside the Texas Department of Corrections, he immediately began plotting his next escape. He was now inmate number 00762599 at the Stiles Unit, a high-security prison, surrounded by fences and guard towers. It was supposed to be escape-proof. Stephen studied the facility, watched the patterns, looked for the weakness. He noticed that civilian medical staff moved in and out regularly, doctors and nurses in green scrubs. They weren't heavily monitored. If he could pose as medical personnel, maybe he could walk out, just like before. But could the same trick work twice? Over several weeks, Stephen quietly gathered materials. From the prison arts supply room, he collected green dye, squeezed ink from felt-tip markers into a plastic cup. The pungent alcohol smell filled his cell. He stirred the liquid with a toothbrush until it turned dark emerald. He soaked a white prison uniform in the dye, left it overnight. By morning, it had turned pale green, roughly the color of surgical scrubs. He managed to swipe a blank ID badge, carefully forged an identity card for a fictional doctor. Bit by bit, he prepared. February 24th, 1997, another Friday. Stephen pulled on his dyed green scrubs, hung the fake ID around his neck. 8:45 a.m., the morning shift change, the busiest time. Medical staff moved through the main gate in small groups. Stephen joined them, walked calmly, no rushing. A guard glanced at him. Stephen gave a curt nod, tapped an imaginary pager at his hip, the universal signal of a doctor being called away. For a moment, the guard hesitated, studied Stephen's face for a second longer than comfortable. Would he ask for identification? Would he check the badge up close? Stephen kept walking, kept the rhythm of someone in a hurry, someone too busy to be questioned. The guard at the gate barely looked. He assumed Stephen was just another hospital worker. Would anyone recognize him? The gate opened. Stephen walked out of a Texas state prison in broad daylight, disguised as a doctor. By the time officials realized an inmate was missing, Stephen was long gone. He met up with Philip. Together they slipped out of Texas. This time, they hid in Biloxi, Mississippi, rented a small apartment in late February 1997, tried not to draw attention. For several months, life was quiet, almost normal. March passed, then April, then May, then June, then July. But Texas law enforcement wasn't about to let him rest. They coordinated with federal agents, eventually got a tip about Stephen's location. In early 1998, police units surrounded the Biloxi apartment. There was no way out this time. Stephen and Philip were arrested without incident. For Texas officials, this was the last straw. Stephen had escaped 3 times now, not counting the judge phone call. They were determined it would never happen again. Back in Texas, Stephen faced new felony charges for the prison break. He was swiftly convicted. Another 45 years on top of his existing sentence. His total ballooned to 144 years. Was there any way out of a sentence like that? To many observers, the sentence was shockingly harsh. Stephen was non-violent. His crimes were scams and escapes. Yet he effectively received a lifetime sentence 3 times over. Texas authorities wanted to send a message. No one makes fools of the system. The prison system took extraordinary measures this time. Stephen was transferred to the most secure unit, placed in 23-hour lockdown, solitary confinement. For 1 hour a day, he could exercise alone in a caged yard. then back to isolation. Every communication was monitored, every movement tracked. If any inmate in America was done escaping, it was Stephen Russell. But even under those conditions, Stephen found one last angle. How do you escape from solitary confinement when every movement is watched? Alone in his cell, he began executing his most elaborate con yet. Not on guards, not on the prison itself. On the medical system. Stephen gradually starved himself, took laxatives whenever he could get them, made himself appear increasingly ill. He pretended to suffer memory loss, faked seizures during medical checks. Then he did something remarkable. He secretly typed up fake medical records, used official forms he'd somehow obtained. The documents indicated he had HIV and was in late-stage AIDS. Would anyone verify them? Incredibly, these forged papers ended up in his file. Nobody double-checked them. Seeing his gaunt appearance and the test results on file, prison doctors concluded Stephen was dying. In 1998, with Russell apparently at death's door, the state granted him compassionate parole, special needs release. He was transferred to a civilian nursing facility in Dallas. Guards delivered a wheelchair-bound, frail-looking Stephen to the nursing home. As they left, a nurse whispered to him, told him to rest easy. Stephen smiled weakly. It was exactly what he wanted. He'd maneuvered himself out of prison. Again, not by picking locks, not by disguises, by playing on the system's assumptions and their empathy. But would anyone believe he was actually dead? Now came the final stroke. At the nursing home, Stephen got access to a telephone. March 2nd, 1999, 6:45 a.m. He called the Texas prison officials, posed as a doctor, used the name of a well-known AIDS specialist. This is calling about inmate Stephen J. Russell. I'm sorry to inform you that he passed away this morning. Time of death, 4:17 a.m. I'll fax the death certificate within the hour. My condolences to the department. His voice was somber, professional, convincing. He arranged for a fake death certificate to be sent to the Bureau of Prisons. The document arrived. It looked authentic, official stamps, proper signatures. In short order, Texas formally recorded Stephen J. Russell as deceased. And then he was gone. Dallas, Texas. A quiet morning. The air tasted different. For the first time in years, no walls, no bars, no guards counting heads. Just the sound of cars passing by outside the nursing home. Just the freedom of being officially a dead man. Just the open road ahead. He slipped away from the facility, moved to Florida, lived under an alias. Used credit cards and fake names. Went to restaurants, walked the beaches. But how long could a dead man stay free? For a few brief weeks, he was free. But Texas investigators remained skeptical. Something didn't sit right. They kept digging. The death certificate looked wrong somehow. The signature, the paperwork. In early 1999, they tracked him to Florida. U.S. Marshals swarmed his location, arrested him for what everyone vowed would be the last time. Stephen's face appeared on national news again, the dead man who wasn't really dead. After this final recapture, Texas was done playing games. The judge added additional years for the fake death escape, for the frauds, for embarrassing the system repeatedly. Stephen's total sentence remained at 144 years. Since then, Stephen J. Russell has been held as a model inmate. Not that he had opportunity to misbehave. He spent years in solitary confinement, closely watched, every privilege stripped away. Over the years, sympathetic voices argued that enough was enough. Stephen's crimes were costly, outrageous, but non-violent. He was a con artist and escape artist, but he'd never physically hurt anyone. In 2023, after 25 years behind bars, the state parole board finally agreed to release him. Stephen Russell walked out of prison, age 65, barely recognizable as the man who'd once made national headlines. He paused at the gate, inhaled the warm Texas air. No aliases left, he murmured, just Stephen. What happened to Philip Morris? After serving his short sentence, Philip was released and moved away. He rebuilt his life in quiet obscurity. He and Stephen lost contact over the years, The great love that drove Stephen to such extremes became just another casualty of his criminal saga. Investigators who dealt with Stephen had mixed feelings about him. One Texas officer admitted that Stephen was smart and full of himself, that he absolutely loved the attention. Stephen could be obnoxious, but he was also undeniably charming, which helped him trick so many people. Some captors felt grudging respect for his ingenuity, even as they tightened security to keep him contained. To this day, Stephen J. Russell remains one of the most extraordinary escape artists in American prison history. 4 successful escapes, each more audacious than the last. He walked out the front door twice, impersonated a judge over the phone, posed as a doctor, and literally died on paper to secure his freedom. All driven by one simple motive: love. The kind of love that makes people do impossible things, take extraordinary risks, challenge systems designed to be unbeatable. Stephen Russell proved that with enough intelligence, charm, and sheer audacity, even the most secure prisons have weaknesses. Not in their walls, not in their fences, but in their assumptions about what's possible. And that brings us to the end of our story. If you liked it, don't forget to like and subscribe, and activate the bell button so you can receive new videos.